Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're diving into something um, pretty crucial, I think. No matter who wins this upcoming election, it's the potential overhaul of the U.S. asylum system. We're looking at a New York Times article, just came out a few days ago, October 28th, 2024. It's called Whether Harris or Trump Wins, Seeking Asylum in the U.S. May Never Be the Same. And it's making a pretty bold claim saying both Trump and Harris are signaling some pretty major restrictions on asylum, possibly even getting rid of the system as we know it. That's a huge deal, not just for the U.S., but globally. So let's break down why.
Yeah, it's a big shift for sure. And what's interesting, the article kind of highlights this growing consensus that the system needs a major change.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Yeah.
I mean, the American ideal of offering asylum, it's always been about this idea of a safe harbor for people who are facing persecution.
Yeah.
But is the system actually broken?
Well, the article seems to think so, along with a lot of experts and even everyday Americans. And while it focuses on the election, concerns about the asylum system have been around for decades. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So, what are some of the signs that things aren't working?
One of the biggest examples is the backlog of asylum cases. People are waiting an average of 4 years for a hearing. 4 years.
Wow.
Imagine living in that kind of limbo. All that uncertainty and stress.
Yeah, 4 years is a long time to have your life on hold. I can see how that would make people feel like the system's broken.
Exactly. And to add to that, the Cato Institute found that only 3% of pending asylum applications were actually approved in 2024.
3%. That's incredibly low. It makes you wonder if the long wait times are actually encouraging people to cross the border, even if they know their chances of getting asylum are so slim.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
And it raises these important questions about whether the system is really working the way it's supposed to.
So before we look at the changes that might be coming, can you give us a little historical context? How did we get to this point?
Sure. So the roots of the U.S. asylum system go back to after World War II, after the Holocaust. The world was really determined to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. And offering asylum to people fleeing persecution became a big part of that. And the U.S. really took a lead in shaping this commitment.
Right. And then didn't the Cold War also have a big impact on asylum policies? Like we were way more likely to grant asylum to people fleeing communist countries.
Exactly. The Cold War definitely played a role. And then in 1980, the Refugee Act, it actually laid out the specific grounds for asylum in the U.S. It's for those facing persecution based on religion,
Right.
race, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group.
That last one, particular social group, that seems like it could be open to a lot of different interpretations.
You're right. And in the 80s and 90s, you saw the definition of asylum expand to include people fleeing gang violence in Central America. And that's where it gets tricky, because a lot of that violence was fueled by U.S. policies, like the war on drugs.
Yeah.
So you have this situation where people are fleeing situations that we kind of had a hand in creating.
Right. It adds another whole layer of responsibility there. And then, of course, we have the Trump era, which the article calls a methodical dismantling of the asylum system.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that?
Sure. The Trump administration made it a lot harder to seek asylum in the U.S., for example.
Yeah.
They put in place this metering policy, which limited how many people could apply at ports of entry each day. So a lot of people had to wait in Mexico in dangerous conditions.
So it sounds like even the process of applying for asylum became harder.
Exactly. They also made it much harder to prove a credible fear of persecution.
Ah.
And even when applicants had strong cases, judges had a harder time granting them asylum.
Right. And there was also the Remain in Mexico policy. I think officially it was the Migrant Protection Protocols, which basically forced people to wait in Mexico.
During their whole immigration process, which could be months or even years, and often in these really dangerous camps.
It sounds like a very intentional effort to deter people from seeking asylum here. And then there was also the public health rule during the pandemic.
Right. That was a huge turning point. The Trump administration used Title 42, which is a public health law, to basically expel almost all asylum seekers at the border, saying it was to stop the spread of COVID.
It seems like that set the stage for where we are now. Even though Biden and Harris have a different image than Trump, the article says they're kind of continuing down a similar path, just using different tactics.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this article. It's not just a left versus right issue. It seems like there's a fundamental change happening in how people view asylum across the political spectrum.
So what kinds of restrictions has the Biden administration put in place?
Well, one of the biggest is the increased reliance on the CBP One app. This app lets migrants schedule appointments to apply for asylum, but it's been having all these technical problems, and it has limited capacity. So it's creating another bottleneck.
So even though it's meant to make things easier, it's actually making it harder for a lot of people.
That's right. And the Biden administration, they've also kept some limits on entry points along the border, making it harder for people to even get to the asylum system in the first place.
But the article also points out that Biden officials are defending these policies, saying the drop in illegal border crossings shows they're working.
That's true. And I think this shows how complex this really is. The Biden administration is trying to balance humanitarian values with the political reality of what's happening at the border.
One thing that really stood out to me in the article was this quote from Cecilia Munoz, who was a top immigration advisor during the Obama years. She said, "Our asylum system was really built for a different era." That seems like a clear signal that even within the Democratic Party, there's this feeling that the old way isn't working anymore.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement. And it really highlights how big of a shift we're seeing.
So it sounds like we're at a crossroads. The U.S. asylum system is about to change in a big way, no matter who wins.
Definitely. And it's important to remember, this isn't just happening in the U.S. It's part of a global migration crisis with people fleeing all kinds of things: conflict, persecution, climate change, in record numbers.
So where does the U.S. fit into this? We have this history of offering refuge. What's our role going to be moving forward? That's what we'll be looking at next.
You know, it's easy to focus on the political debate about asylum here in the U.S., but as we were just saying, this is way bigger than just us. Whatever happens here, it affects the whole world.
That's right. That's a really important point. We can't forget this is a global problem, and the U.S. is just one piece of it, even if we are a big player. So what could happen if the asylum system changes? What does the article say?
But it doesn't look good. It says it could get way harder for people to seek asylum here.
Yeah.
Maybe even impossible for some. And we're talking about people who are already really vulnerable, people who could face even more harm or even death if they can't find safety.
That's a horrible thought. It makes you wonder what will happen to America's reputation. We've always been seen as this champion of human rights, a safe place for people who are oppressed. But if we stop doing that, what message does that send?
It really challenges our image on the world stage. If we abandon this commitment to protecting people, it could really hurt our credibility as a defender of human rights.
It seems like a dangerous thing to do, not just for us, but for everyone. If people lose hope that they can find safety, could it lead to more instability and conflict around the world?
It's definitely a risk. When people feel like they have no other options, they might do desperate things. And it also creates this void that authoritarian regimes are happy to fill if the U.S. steps back from human rights. It makes those who want to suppress freedoms and persecute their own people bolder.
That's a scary thought. So where does that leave the U.S.? Are we still a symbol of hope? Or is that image fading?
That's the big question, and that's one we all need to think about. The choices we make, the policies we support, they have huge consequences for the world.
It feels like a really important moment in history, but
The article does mention some people and organizations that are fighting back against these restrictions. They're trying to preserve a more humane approach to asylum.
right. And those voices are so important. They're lawyers and advocates and groups working so hard to defend those values that have always been a part of America's role in the world. Their efforts show us that even when things are tough, there's always hope and a reason to keep fighting for what's right.
So what can everyday people do? Are there any practical steps they can take to make a difference? First, get informed. Read articles like the one we're discussing. Stay up to date on the issues. Understand the different sides. Then find an organization that you connect with and support them. You can volunteer, donate money, or even just spread the word about their work.
What about contacting our elected officials? Does that actually do anything?
Definitely. Reach out to your representatives. Tell them what you think about this issue and hold them accountable. Participate in public forums. Write letters to the editor. Use social media to amplify the voices of those affected by these policies. Every action, every voice adds to the movement for change.
It's really inspiring to see all these people working to create a more just and humane system. And we have to remember, this isn't just about principles. It's about real people's lives.
Exactly. We can't forget about the human cost of these policies. We're talking about individuals, families, children, fleeing unimaginable things, just looking for safety and a better life.
So far, we've mostly talked about the arguments against restricting asylum. But the article does present the other side too, right? What are some of the reasons people support limiting asylum, or at least changing the system?
Yeah, the article brings up those views. One of the most common arguments is that the current system just isn't working. It's overwhelmed. There's a huge backlog. and it's easy for criminal organizations to take advantage of it.
And then there's the economic argument, too. Some people are worried about the cost of supporting asylum seekers. They say it puts a strain on resources and takes jobs away from American citizens.
Right, that comes up a lot. And of course, there's the security aspect.
Yeah.
Some people believe a more open asylum system makes the country less safe because it's easier for dangerous people to get in.
It seems like this issue is so complicated, with valid points on every side. It's tempting to think of it as black and white, but the truth is much more nuanced.
I agree. We need to approach this with empathy and be open to understanding different perspectives. We have to be able to see the legitimate concerns about security in the economy while also upholding our commitment to human rights and showing compassion to those seeking refuge.
Finding that balance seems like the biggest challenge. How do we create a system that's fair and actually works? One that protects vulnerable people, but also addresses real worries about national security and economic stability.
That's what policymakers are trying to figure out. And it's something that needs a lot of thought and open discussion. There's no easy answer. But the stakes are too high to ignore.
The article kind of suggests that even if Biden wins again, we probably won't go back to the more open asylum policies of the past.
It's hard to know for sure, but things have definitely changed politically. Public opinion has shifted. And there seems to be this growing agreement, even among Democrats, that the system needs to be reformed.
So if both parties are moving towards restricting asylum, what does that mean for the future of the system? What kinds of changes are they talking about?
Well, the article mentions a few things. One idea is to make the process faster and more efficient, so people with legitimate claims would get asylum more quickly, and those without valid claims could be processed and maybe removed from the country faster.
That sounds good. But how would that even work? Wouldn't we need to put a lot more money into the immigration courts? They're already underfunded and struggling to handle the cases they have now.
You're right. Any real reform would require a big commitment of resources and a change in priorities. It wouldn't be a quick fix. There are also some proposals that take a different approach.
Like what? I'm curious.
One idea that's gaining some attention is a more regional approach to asylum, where countries in the Western Hemisphere would work together to share the responsibility for processing claims, maybe by creating regional processing centers, or a system where people could apply from their home countries.
Or from neighboring countries.
That's interesting. It could take some of the pressure off the U.S. system
No.
and make things more fair across the region. Exactly. It recognizes that this is a problem for everyone, and it needs a shared solution. It also tries to provide protection closer to home so people wouldn't have to make these dangerous journeys to get to the U.S. border.
But wouldn't that require a big change in thinking, not just here, but in other countries too?
Definitely. It would need a level of cooperation we haven't really seen before. But some experts think it's the only way to make a system that's both sustainable and humane in the long run.
It's a big challenge, but it's worth thinking about. It shows that we need new ideas. When it comes to dealing with global migration, we can't just stick with the old ways. We have to be willing to consider new approaches that work for the 21st century.
Absolutely. This isn't just about tweaking the current system. It's about reimagining how we approach asylum and refugee protection in a world that's changing all the time.
This has been a really fascinating discussion, but it definitely brings up more questions than it answers. When we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the future of asylum and look at some of the ethical dilemmas and what it all means for America's role in the world. Stay tuned. We're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the future of asylum here in the U.S. We've talked about so much already, the history to the current situation, possible reforms, and it's clear this issue has a ton of implications, and I think it really gets at who we are as a country and what we represent on the world stage.
It really does. And, we've been discussing the policies and the legal side of things, but it's important to remember the heart of this is people, real people, individuals and families running from danger, looking for safety, a chance for a better life.
Yeah, it's easy to lose sight of that when you're talking about numbers and laws, but we can't forget about the human cost of all this. And like we've seen, there's this tension between wanting to be true to our values, offering refuge, and the really tough challenge of managing a system that's completely overwhelmed right now.
And that tension brings up some serious ethical questions, like how do we balance what asylum seekers need with the needs of our own citizens? How do we make sure things are fair and people are treated justly while also thinking about things like security and making sure the system can actually work? And how do we figure out our moral responsibilities when it's getting harder to tell the difference between people migrating for economic reasons and those who are truly forced to leave their homes?
Man, those are tough questions. And I'm glad you brought up the ethical side of things. That's something we can't ignore. And I think it's important to say there are good points on all sides of this debate. It's not just about right and wrong.
I agree, and that's why it's so important to talk about this openly and respectfully, to listen to each other and be willing to question our own assumptions.
The New York Times article we've been looking at, it really dives into those moral complexities, talking about the real impact of these policy changes and the potential for more suffering and hopelessness if it gets even harder to seek asylum here.
Right. It makes you think about our collective conscience as a society. If we turn away people who need help, what does that say about us? What kind of world are we leaving for the generations that come after us?
It's a heavy thing to consider, and it shows just how important this issue is. It's not just about immigration, it's about who we are as a people, our values, our sense of justice, our compassion for those in need.
You said it's about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of world we want to pass on to our children.
The article ends on a pretty somber note saying that America might not be that symbol of hope for asylum seekers anymore.
It's a tough pill to swallow, and it raises the question: if the U.S. backs away from its role as a leader on this win, what happens to the whole system of protecting refugees around the world? What happens to people running from danger if even the U.S. shuts them out?
That's a huge question, and it's one we all need to think about as a country, as individuals. What kind of world do we want? What kind of mark do we want to leave on history?
And as we come to the end of this deep dive, I'm feeling a sense of agency, but also hope. The challenges are big. But so is the possibility for positive change. We can't just sit back. We need to be a part of this conversation, fight for policies that match our values, and stand with those seeking refuge.
I couldn't have said it better myself. This has been an eye-opening conversation, and I hope it encourages our listeners to keep learning about this complex issue, the future of asylum, here in the U.S. and around the globe. It's in our hands. It's up to each of us to choose compassion, to choose justice, to choose a world where everyone has a chance to be safe and build a better life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.